Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our virtual event with James J. Berg and Chris Freeman, the editors of Isherwood in Transit. We're so grateful that our bookstore is able to continue bringing authors and their works to our community during this uncertain time. Before we get started, I would like to go over some house rules and some announcements. Our next virtual event is scheduled for Tuesday, June 30th, with Donovan Hahn and Tom Bissell at 6 p.m. You can learn more about our virtual events on our website and as well as our social media. If you have questions for any of our speakers today, make sure to use the Ask a Question function at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you find interesting, and they'll make its way to the very top of the list. And if you're interested in supporting our bookstore, you'll find the Purchase Isherwood in Transit button right below the viewer screen. It's in green, and it'll take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. And with that said, let me briefly introduce our main speakers for today's event. James J. Berg is the Associate Dean of Faculty at the Borough of Manhattan Community College and is a co-editor of Isherwood on Writing, which was published in 2008. And Chris Freeman is the Professor of English at the University of Southern California. He is a co-editor of The American Isherwood, which was published in 2014, Conversations with Christopher Isherwood, and the Isherwood Century. And with that said, I'm going to turn the screen over to them. Enjoy the talk, everybody. And also forgive us for any technical difficulties.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Berg.
I'm Chris Freeman.
Chris Freeman. Happy Pride. We're very happy that Isherwood in Transit has come out in June in time for Pride Month. And want to acknowledge, Chris and I are in the same room for the first time in months and practicing our social distancing here on the screen. So we feel really weird about it, but I hope it comes across all right. We're going to start off with just a bit of background about Christopher Isherwood. He was born in England in 1904 and moved to Berlin in 1929. His best known British work is Goodbye to Berlin from 1938. That was published with another novel called Mr. Norris Changes Trains in the United States as the Berlin Stories. Many of you will be very familiar with that book, and many more of you will be familiar with the stage and film musical featuring Sally Bowles, adapted by Candor and Ebb into Cabaret. Isherwood came to the United States with his friend, the poet W.H. Auden, in January of 1939, and soon after landed in New York. Soon after he left Auden in New York and settled in Los Angeles, where he became a devotee of Swami Prabhavananda and was a practicing Vedantist for the rest of his life. In 1953, he began a relationship with Don Bacardi, who was 30 years his junior. Don became a portrait artist, and the two of them were together for 33 years until Chris died in 1986. The photos in Isherwood in Transit are by Don Bacardi on a trip they took to Monument Valley in 1953. And these photographs have never been published before, so we're very happy to have those photographs. Here he is at the Hoover Dam.
And those all live at the Huntington in the archive there.
As an American writer, Isherwood is known best for his 1964 novel, A Single Man, and his 1976 memoir, Christopher and His Kind. And those two books kind of made him into a gay icon late in life. So now I'm going to turn it over to my partner here, Chris Freeman, and I'll step back.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for being here. Jim, it's good to be with you again. Our first book, which is called The Isherwood Century, and that little sticker means it won a Lambda Literary Award in 2000. It was a very exciting day in our lives we will never forget. But we came to this because when I moved to Minnesota in 1995 to take my first job, Jim Berg was the only person I knew. And we started talking about working together on something, which people in the humanities don't do that often. And very quickly, we arrived at a writer we both loved, Christopher Isherwood, and we realized nobody was doing much on him. So we organized a talk at the MLA called Christopher Isherwood 10 Years Gone, because he had died in 1986. So we wanted to kind of assess his career and see where he was, and that's led to us working on him for all this time. So I'm going to read a short passage from the introduction to Isherwood in Transit to give you a little background on our kind of scholarly relationship. One of the speakers that you'll meet today, Carola Kaplan, was part of that first panel we did in 1996. And it turns out she had written the first dissertation on Isherwood. So we'll talk to Carola about that in about half an hour. So I'm in the introduction now. This is a section called 20 Years and Counting. Christopher has been kind to us throughout the years we've spent working on him. It's rather uncommon for humanities scholars to work together. Our collaboration started on a walk around Lake Harriet in Minneapolis on a sunny, cold Sunday afternoon. In Minnesota, you go outside wrapped up whenever the sun shines between Halloween and Mother's Day. In 1995, since we were living in the same city, we thought maybe we should do some fun work together. But who? So we struck gold with Christopher Isherwood. This collaboration among Chris and Jim and Christopher has taken us many places. Most significantly, in 1997, we traveled together to Southern California to meet Don Picardi, Isherwood's partner. At that first meeting, he put us in touch with many people who knew Isherwood, and we were able to spend time with their friends and associates, some of whom would write essays for us for the Isherwood Century, and some of those people, by the way, are here with us today. This feels like an Isherwood family reunion, and we're very excited about how that feels. 20 years and several books later, we too have been in transit. Like Isherwood, we fell in love with Southern California, which led to our eventual departure from Minneapolis. I moved to West Hollywood in 2005. A couple of years later, Jim followed me to Palm Springs, which is where we're speaking to you from today. Jim now lives in New York part of the time, but he still loves Palm Springs. Is Isherwood in transit the end of our partnership? We don't think so, but for now, as we wrap up this 20-plus year chapter, we are nothing but grateful to Christopher Isherwood, to Don Picardi, and to the many friends, scholars, and students with whom we have shared Isherwood. One thing we know for sure, the quality and range of the material in this volume demonstrate that Isherwood's legacy is in good hands. We're confident that new theoretical and historical work will be done in the coming years, thanks to the Huntington Archive, to the Isherwood Foundation, and through the groundwork established by many of the scholars and writers we have in this book. We are all of us proud to be his kind. And so many of those people are here today, and we just want to get right to the program. Jim, I want you to say a couple more things, and then we're going to bring on our first guest.
Yeah. So this book started as a symposium at the Huntington Library, where Isherwood's papers are housed. We want to thank the Huntington particularly, as well as the Christopher Isherwood Foundation, the University of Minnesota Press published this beautiful book, and the University of Southern California. Just a little bit more from the introduction. I mentioned how Isherwood had moved to Berlin and then came to the United States. He said in an interview later in life that his move to California, he was looking for a kind of homeland, and we think that's what he found when he landed in Los Angeles. So just Isherwood in Transit, we think, is an effort to understand the challenges Isherwood faced as a consequence of all of his travel, the inherent rootlessness and feelings of dislocation and even desperation that ended with his settling in Los Angeles and becoming an American. We see this volume as a follow-up to our previous book, The American Isherwood, also published by the University of Minnesota Press, in which we make the case for Isherwood as an American writer. He became a U.S. citizen in 1946 and spent the rest of his career exploring his own version of the American vernacular. He also contributed significantly to the literary legacy of Los Angeles, and much wandering occurred before he finally settled down in Southern California. Indeed, even after he found his new home, he remained rather unsettled for another decade. His transit during that time was spiritual and personal rather than geographical. So now we should welcome Armistead Moffman into the room. Rira, we're very excited to have Armistead here, and I'll turn it over to Chris.
So I want to, Armistead, to welcome you live from London. We thank you so much for being here. We first met Armistead when he wrote the foreword for the Isherwood Century. And, everyone is a fan of your books, Armistead, and your style and the ease with which you relate to your readers is something that you certainly inherited from Christopher Isherwood, your logical grandfather. We had you as the opening speaker for that Huntington conference because we knew that you would bring a crowd just like you did today. And we also knew that you would just knock it out of the park, and you did. You scandalized us all by doing a kind of sexy talk about those heady days. So tell us maybe a little bit about how you remember meeting Christopher, and then maybe you can read a little for us from your Logical Family memoir.
Sure. We've got some Bacardis behind me on the wall here, you'll see, so it really is a family reunion. I talked to Don not long ago, and he threatened to come visit me in London because he said he'd always wanted to come here and play. And Chris was, once he got out of England, he was gone. That's in keeping with the theme you're discussing tonight. He was really ready to leave England behind, so I hope he does. That would be sweet. I met them at an Oscar night party in, well, the big, it was for Saturday Night Fever. I should place it in time for you. And it was one of those West Hollywood boys, I always say star-studded, 40 studs and 1 star. And Chris was the star. And there he was, eyes twinkling against the wall with Don next to him, who just was at his most beautiful then. I said in my book that he reminded me of a higher breed of blonde with his shiny gray hair. He was like a beach bred blonde. And I went over to them because I recognized Chris from a recent PBS special, and had seen those little sparkling blue eyes. And I was very cheeky for a young person. I mean, young people are by nature cheeky. And I went over and asked him, I said, I've written a book. Tales of the City was just out. I've written a book. Would you mind reviewing it for the LA Times? I had no idea how these things worked. And he said, boy, I may be able to give you a blurb. And so I did. I got the book to him. I was embarrassed to get it to him because those of you who remember the early book, it was a big floppy trade paperback that looked more like a comic book. And I thought, I can't believe I'm sending this book off to this literary giant that looks like this. But he was very generous about it, and gave me a blurb that I've used ever since about how it reminded him of the work of Dickens. And I was invited down to the house shortly thereafter. And I felt as if I say in my memoir that I felt as if I were going to Somerset Maugham's Villa Moresque or one of those. It was very exotic to me. And I mentioned it as a giant villa in a way. I mean, it seemed that way to me at the time, going down those steps into Santa Monica Canyon. The top of the house was at the level with the street. I have a description of it here. The place struck me as grand and rambling at the time. It's not. Just a few smallish rooms and a studio tucked into a hillside with only these rooftops visible below the street above. You can't see the house from anywhere else nearby, so it has to be experienced from the, I'm sorry, light's awful in here. It has to be experienced from the inside out, where the glint of the sea through the tall blue shuttered windows wildly inflates the imagination. And Chris and Dom had a similar effect on me. Those fabled lovers had met on the beach below this house where Chris was 48, when Chris was 48 and Don was 18. I'm going to turn on the light.
There you go. When I was first teaching with Zoom Armistead, the first night of my evening class, I couldn't see a thing. So I had
I had bad eyesight anyway. So, after that first day on Adelaide Drive, Isherwood wrote in his diary that he and I might become friends. But this is when I discovered I was in Liberation. I've never waited a volume of memoir more nervously than that one. since I knew it would be the one that I would be in. Gore Vidal once made an inscription in a book that he gave to Norman Mailer, in a memoir, that said "Hi Norm" in the margin of the index. Go there and look for his name immediately. We might become friends, but he was still waiting to see. Who could blame him when you're 70-something and a half years old? Young writers who come on strong about your brilliance and not to be trusted. Only middle-aged artists believe in their own genius. The old know better. Listen to how Isherwood described a gay rights benefit he addressed in San Francisco in 1981. Armistead Maupin introduced me, going heavy on the praise, exalting me, in fact, to the position of America's old Mr. Queer. He was basically a friend, I feel, not one of those flattering foes. Knowing this would have disturbed me at the time, but now it makes perfect sense. We old-timers tend to squirm at eulogies delivered before our funerals. As it happened, Chris had only 4 years left. If I had been his kind of diarist, or any kind of diarist at all, I could offer a rich array of my limited time with him. What's left now, I'm afraid, are just a few overhoned anecdotes and the sweet afterglow of laughter and fellowship in that house on Adelaide Drive. Whenever I was in Los Angeles, Chris and Don generously folded me into their circle of friends, a variable feast that could mean anyone from David Hockney to roving poets and porn actors. I remember chicken dinners dished out by a poker-faced Romanian housekeeper named Natalie, while the men at the table gabbed about movies or gave literal blow-by-blows of a sex club on Fairfax called Basic Plumbing. That must have gotten Huntington upset. Was that it?
Maybe.
Natalie must have had an earful in her time. I wasn't there myself the night that John Travolta gave an impromptu performance of a scene from Cruising, but I can't help wondering if Natalie was. According to Chris, Travolta knew the scene by heart and shoved his jeans below his jockey shorts for Pacino's campy climactic hips or lips line. If there are better ways to thank your host for a lovely evening, they don't immediately come to mind. Then there was a chilly night when the dinner guests were gathered with drinks around the living room fire. Chris looked almost preppy in jeans and a tweed jacket with elbow patches, bouncing on the heels of his loafers as if to syncopate the conversation. When Doc turned to Eddie Murphy, Chris recognized the name and declared, "Oh, yes, Eddie Murphy. Marvelous, funny man." One of the guests, the actress Rae Dawn Chong, said what some of us were already thinking, "But Chris, he's terribly homophobic," to which Isherwood replied, without a moment's hesitation, "Well, fuck him then, just fuck him." There was always an imp at play behind Chris' eyes. More than once I was prompted to offer him a toke off a joint, but he invariably declined, explaining that he and Don had once had a nightmarish reaction to a bowl of keef Paul Bowles had given them in Morocco. Then thoughtfully, he would add, "I don't mind if you do, though I love the smell of it around me." I'm sure there was plenty of it around him the night a group of us piled into a car to see a cabaret singer performing in the San Fernando Valley. Don was driving, so Chris was stretched out across the three men in the back seat. You know, that's what he did. He didn't want to see you when Don was driving.
I don't blame him.
This singer was a female friend of a friend, an unknown commodity. So there was speculation in the car as to whether the cabaret would be gay. Chris offered clues along the way by gleefully reading aloud the signs that passed his limited field of vision. Midas muffler, he would crow. That's very bad news indeed. But finally, as Don came to a stop at a decidedly lackluster mini mall, Pioneer Chicken. Thank God it is a gay place. It was not a gay place, at least not one until we arrived. The singer was touchingly earnest and untalented. Savoring the irony, I leaned over to Chris and murmured, "Sally Bowles," in his ear. By then he had a drink or two, and so he replied a little too loudly, "Sally was never this dreadful." He was indulging me, of course. I remember looking around the table and realizing that 6 different decades of gay men were represented in our group. Isherwood had his arm around Steve Beery, the youngest one. Across the table was Gavin Lambert, the almost 60-something novelist who had given me the endearing tomboy character Daisy Clover even before I met Sally Bowles. I remember thinking at that moment, this is how it should be. This is how the camaraderie of queers can span generations, offering solace between young and old, bonding us through friendship and sex and art. And not just among the living. Chris was part of a lineage that reached back through Forster and Malm to Wilde and Whitman and Carpenter and every unknown soldier and working class roughneck who had ever rolled in the hay with them. I found this genealogy to be more appealing than the one I had been taught to revere in North Carolina, that bone-dry roster of long-gone planters and generals with their broodmare wives standing invisibly in the background. Here at last was ancestor worship with blood in its veins.
That is so perfect as a way to kick off an event on Pride Weekend, Armistead, to talk about that genealogy that we're all so happy to be part of.
I was trying to think of what summed it up for me.
Yeah, thank you.
About being in part of Chris's circle.
Yes, so Rira, we want to go ahead and bring on now our next guest to hang out with Armistead for a few minutes, Chris Bram. Chris is the author of Imminent Outlaws, which is a book about gay American writers. He's also the author of Father of Frankenstein. If you know the film Gods and Monsters, that you can thank him for that. Chris, we asked you to write the foreword for this book because you had written so well and so beautifully about Isherwood in Imminent Outlaws. And I had met you at the event we did for the American Isherwood in New York. You were so generous to talk about Isherwood then. So feel free to say hi to Armistead, and then I want to hear a little bit from you about how you came to write about Isherwood and how you sort of, as you say, a fan's note in your piece. So welcome from New York. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me. Armistead, great to see you again. It's been too long. Maybe just jump right in with Armistead, I met Isherwood through the movie Cabaret. I mean, that was, we both became aware of his work through a movie musical. I mean, how many authors does that happen with? But then I kind of began reading around in him and discovering him, and I've been reading him steadily ever since then, always coming back to him and kind of forgetting about him, coming back, getting to know him better, and then moving on. And I talk about this in my foreword, which was kind of fun to explore my roundabout adventures with Christopher Isherwood, who unfortunately I've never met. I envy Armistead having been able to spend time with him. I know Isherwood only through his books, and feel I know him oddly well. I mean, it's kind of, there's something so wonderfully transparent about him in his best books. But one of the things, it was when I wrote Imminent Outlaws, and I kind of was putting Isherwood in the context of the other writers of his generation, people like Gore Vidal, of course, and Truman Capote, and James Baldwin, and Tennessee Williams, and seeing how his life compared to theirs. And I was kind of amazed at how much better he did, how more grounded he was, how he kept saying he caught the same abuse they did. I mean, it's one of the things that was depressing about writing this book was all these constant insults in the literary world as these people wrote their books, just how they were looked down upon and condescended to and just sneered at. And no wonder a lot of them would turn to alcohol, would turn to drugs. It was, and Isherwood got the same abuse. I mean, it was, but he remained more centered. He survived it. And let me just read a couple of paragraphs that, and I became fascinated by that. And
that's not something that you expected to find, right? You just kind of realized that.
I did. I realized it after the fact. It was kind of writing. I found when I was writing the book, and I'm reading and rereading everybody along the same time, I enjoyed being around him more than the others because he wasn't going crazy the way the others were. I mean, I understood why they were going crazy. It made perfect sense. I mean, the abuse that James Baldwin got from both not just the white literary community, but the black political community too. It was endless. I mean, the Eldridge Cleaver's attacks on him are just vile. Yeah. And he tried to remain calm outwardly, but you could tell he was seething inside.
And hurting.
And hurting, yeah, he was in pain.
Yeah. Okay, well, share with us a little bit from your foreword. Share with us a little bit from your essay.
Yeah, let me just kind of read a couple of paragraphs about his why he survived, which I do find interesting. His survival fascinates me. Critics attacked him as viciously as they did Williams, Capote, Baldwin, and Vidal, and he sometimes indulged in alcohol as much as they did. But unlike them, he endured. I believe his strength came from two sources. One was his spiritual side, the aspect of himself that he explored and developed through Vedanta, the Hindu philosophy he studied for half of his life. I don't understand that school of knowledge myself, even after reading his detailed discussions in My Guru and His Disciple and A Meeting by the River. But his fascination with it showed a strong spiritual side that held him together, in much the same way his friend Auden used the Church of England for structure. The other source of strength was his 33 years with Don Bacardi. This was not always an easy relationship. It can be embarrassing to read the diaries with their endless accounts of arguments and anger, especially if you're in a long-term relationship yourself. It is so painfully recognizable. A married friend said that after reading the diaries, he was glad he didn't keep a diary himself, or he'd have to burn it. But Isherwood never burned his pages, and Bacardi published them, making clear to the world how important they were to each other in bad times as well as good ones. So it was kind of like that. Those two rocks. The relationship is the most important. It kind of kept Isherwood centered, kept him sane, and for me as a reader, just made him very good company. So no, I never met him, but I feel like there's so much of him in his books. There's so much of him on the page that I feel like I have met him, and I'm grateful for it. He's kind of like this model, this role model. And I think with Jim and Chris, you found that you've done multiple books about him. We do not get tired of him. Artist said, you don't get tired of him. You did not get tired of his company.
And it's true, when you pull his diaries off the shelf and read them now, you can hear his voice. He's there in the room with you. And that's what writers need to accomplish, really, to have the voice heard. It's miraculous, really.
It is miraculous, yeah.
And that's why he's so fun to write about, he's so fun to read, and he's so fun to teach, because there's a way in. There's always a way in with him. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you. Jim wants to thank you. We're going to let you guys go and enjoy the rest of the event and bring in our next guests. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for having us. This was great. I'm enjoying this. Yeah.
And thank you for that beautiful essay, A Fan's Note. Is really just the perfect piece to begin our book.
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking me to write. I really enjoyed writing.
Thank you for that. So we're next going to bring in Sue Hodson, who is recently of the Huntington and is an amazing archivist. So, Jim, welcome Sue for us.
Hi, Sue. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
It's great to have you here, and thank you, Armistead and Chris, for that conversation. Sue Hodson is recently retired from the Huntington Library, where she was curator of literary manuscripts. And Sue was the person instrumental in acquiring the archive, Christopher Isherwood's archive, and processing it once it got to the Huntington. So can you tell us a little bit about how the papers arrived at the Huntington and your role in that?
Definitely. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. It's a great pleasure. And Jim and Chris, I thank you for the wonderful book you've put together. You were just amazing as shepherds to lead us all along the path. So thank you. In the late 1990s, Don Bacardi and his agent approached the Huntington to see if we had any interest in Isherwood's papers. To say we did is one of the understatements of the century. We just were so excited beyond belief. So happily, it all worked out. The papers came to the library, and I was on the front line to be able to open this collection that no one had seen before except for Don. And what an honor that was. And, you know, an archivist learns a lot about the owner of papers, the creator of papers, by looking at the way they're organized, the way they're arranged, or unorganized and disarranged. Well, Isherwood was meticulous, and after I really started reading him, this didn't surprise me. Everything was in perfect order, and he had annotated with dates the undated materials. That's going to endear him to every archivist, because one of the banes of our lives would be trying to date something that isn't dated. But Isherwood's papers were in perfect order. This enabled me to do something that I never did before or after with any other collection, which is to divide the processing and cataloging among about 3 of us. There was myself, and then I brought in 2 other people to help work on it. We divided it into sections. They were discrete sections, easily identifiable, and we stayed in constant communication with each other, but we worked on separate parts of it. And this enabled us to process and catalog the collection much more quickly. It was out and available in a year and a half, which is a stunningly fast pace for a collection of that size and its complexity. And we did single item processing. We did deep subject analysis, deep description and cataloging, which I think serves the scholars brilliantly down the road. And it was a great fun for all of us.
Yeah, I have, I think, 2 versions of the finding aid that you put together on my computer that I've gone back to so often.
Yeah.
Part of the acquisition, as you know, I'll let the audience know, part of the acquisition was also created a relationship between the then new Christopher Isherwood Foundation and the Huntington. And the foundation has been supporting scholars with fellowships to study at the Huntington to use the papers. I was lucky enough to get the first Isherwood Fellowship at the Huntington, and was there, I think, in 2002 for about 2 months.
And that's when you did the Isherwood on Writing book.
Right, and that was the work that I did to bring out Isherwood on Writing, which is based on
there it is.
based on lectures that Isherwood gave in the 1960s around Southern California. The scholar side to work in the archive to see transcripts of said lectures as well as audio of a number of things. It was just a dream to be there, and you were so helpful.
It was a great pleasure. One of the things that we love in a research library is enabling the scholars to come in, making the material available, furthering and encouraging their research use of the collections. And as you say, the Isherwood Foundation has partnered with the Huntington, both for fellows. They give out 1 or 2 fellowships a year. They also sponsor an annual endowed lecture called the Isherwood Bacardi Lecture. And these are just fantastic programs that bring in more and more people. They keep Isherwood alive.
Well, and we were able to publish. Yes. We were able to publish Edmund White's Becoming Gay in the 60s. That was one of the Isherwood lectures. So it's in the new book. It's a wonderful piece on single man and on that same area that Thomas did talking about.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So it's been endlessly exciting and gratifying to watch the furthering of Isherwood scholarship happening at the Huntington. It's just terrific.
And so you wrote about Isherwood and what you called the California Dream.
Yes.
Can you share a couple? We made it chapter 1 in the book.
Oh, wow.
It was our introduction this time. You did the heavy lifting. Really introduced.
Oh, my goodness. Well, a great honor, I have to say.
Yeah.
Sure. Kevin Starr, the California historian,
Yeah.
is the first one to really, he coined the phrase the California dream. At least I believe he did. And so, invoking the qualities that he sees in the California dream, he identified a fresh beginning for people. He said the California dream is the ultimate American dream. People came to America to follow their dream, to reinvent themselves. And people also went to California to do the same. So it gives people a fresh beginning. It gives them opportunity. It can provide success. It makes for them a freer way of life. And it offers freedom to believe and live as they wish and as they choose. And those last 2 points are really important for Christopher Isherwood. He was looking for a place where he could write, where he could craft a set of beliefs for himself, and where he could live openly and freely as a gay man. He found all of that in California. A historian named Peter Blodgett has coined a phrase that's called the land of golden dreams to describe California. And I think Isherwood found his land of golden dreams. And he was able to thrive and produce and be happy. He met Don and had a lifelong relationship with him. Soon after he arrived, he began to see real evidence of this freedom, the freedom to be who you want to be without constriction, without limitations. And he wrote home to his mother about what he was seeing. And I'll just read one sentence from my favorite, you guys know what I'm getting to, my favorite passage in all those letters. He says, "We all live openly in the great eye of the sunshine. And if you appear dressed in red velvet or leading a baby puma, nobody bats an eyelid." And that is a great, succinct capture of what California meant to Isherwood and his life and his work. Let me just read the last 2 paragraphs of my essay. It's playing out this theme. Reviewing Isherwood's writing career after he settled in California, we can observe that he did advance his writing technique while at the same time staying largely true to his long-standing, largely autobiographical approach. In examining what he knew best himself, he was able to tease out meaning that could speak for others as well. His characters were drawn from life, but they also were his own creations. He had long believed in truth as distinct from facts. That is, one can and sometimes must stretch and alter the literal facts in order to arrive at the truth behind and within them. He told an interviewer, quote, "I do try to convey, if it doesn't sound too pompous, the inwardness of experience. You cut corners, you invent, you simplify, you heighten certain lights, and you deepen certain shadows, as you might in a portrait," unquote. In a lecture titled "Writing as a Way of Life," Isherwood elaborated on this concept, quote, "You only use the experience to create the myth which corresponds to the inner reality. That explains why what is really doubtful in art is not the same as what is truthful in a newspaper report of a fire or a murder, and is not the same as your autobiography told in completely factual terms," unquote. Isherwood's place in Anglo-American letters is assured, and his statue continues to grow. Since his papers came to the Huntington in 1999, scholarly publications have burgeoned, and his own books continue to be reprinted. Did Isherwood attain his California dream? I think we can assert a resounding yes. Through his belief in Vedanta, he developed his ability to discover his own nature and to live according to it. In the greater freedom of life in California, he was able to live much more openly as a gay man, and he met his life partner, Don Bacardi. Finally, he produced works of fiction that reached scores of readers with their combination of creativity and experience. Isherwood knew how important California was for him. He described the Golden State as the place, quote, "where we make the mistakes first and then learn from them," unquote. And he certainly did this. At the end of his life, he was beginning to work on an autobiography. Its working title was California. It was never completed, but the rest of his remarkable works are there for us, acclaimed by both critics and fans. Alan Wilde, in his biography of Christopher Isherwood, observed that Isherwood, quote, "has been one of the period's most original ironists and one of its most subtle moral thinkers as well," unquote. Isherwood's favorite fan letter said, quote, "You try to describe what it's like to be alive," unquote. It's a grand, outsized claim, but he did that for all of us, and we will all benefit from him and be enriched by his works for many years to come.
That's great, Sue. We're going to bring in Wendy Moffat, one of our other contributors, and before she comes in, and you're going to stay on for a bit, we want to thank you for all of your work and support over the 20 years that we've been associated.
It's been a great pleasure. Always great pleasure.
How many emails do you have from us asking you every possible favor? So we're delighted to have Wendy Moffat joining us from Pennsylvania. Wendy teaches at Dickinson College and wrote a brilliant biography of E.M. Forster called A Great Unrecorded History that, Wendy, I learned so much from. And then you came to our conference and gave this wonderful talk at the very end where you talked about the queer archive and the relationship between Forster and Isherwood really in the future. And so, so thank you for that beautiful essay for our book. And we wanted you to be on with Sue so that you guys could talk a little bit about how you use an archive and how you find what's hidden.
That's great. First of all, I just want to say thanks so much to Sue, who was the midwife for so many scholars, including myself, getting to a very complex, rich, and layered archive that links to other archives, principally at King's College, Cambridge for me, with the other side of the Forster dialogue, but also into archives like the One Archive in LA, oral history archives, a whole series of what I call quotidian queer, which I think Isherwood really honored the ordinariness of human gay people in a way that made it very approachable for his friend Forster. We know Isherwood as a narrative innovator, but the chapter in this wonderful anthology that I'm interested in pursuing and that I wrote focuses on Isherwood's importance in literary history. We've already heard from Chris Bram that he never burned any pages. And we've also heard from Sue that he was the curator of his own papers. And I think that those two things are central to the construction of the self that Isherwood had, which is to say, he was himself at every moment that he recorded. And he let those layers of selves create a kind of sedimentary reflection on things, because he was always aware of both the developing queer archive and also the really powerful forces that suppressed, oppressed, and erased it. And so the piece of the archive that's interesting to me in relation to Forster is that, like Chris was saying, Isherwood was much younger than Forster, a little bit more than a generation younger. Met Forster in the 30s, and Forster recognized in talking to Chris that Chris was looking for the kind of queer kinship that went back, a kind of queer genealogy, a sense that these things that had been erased still lived on, that Forster himself had felt in relation to the great sexual guru and mentor for him, Edward Carpenter, who had been a lover of Walt Whitman. So honestly, sort of, quite literally going back at least the 60 years that Chris was describing. So we know the most famous of the parts of this story is the way that Christopher Isherwood nurtured Forster's queer novel Morris, which was posthumously published, a seminal novel because it insisted that a gay love story could be happy. But we also know the story that over and over again, Forster didn't feel that he could publish it while first his mother was living and then while his partner and then his partner's wife were living, but that would be too hurtful for them. And so there was this kind of tension that went on. And Chris let that be. He encouraged and he saw to some real changes in the manuscript of Morris between the time he first saw it in 1933 and the time that it was published posthumously in the early 70s. But that story is is sort of well documented. What's less well documented, I think, is the kind of stuff that you find in Sue's archives and others. And that is this fragmentary, conditional, contingent sense of selves emerging, and the kind of dialogic sense that both Forster and Chris understood was part of becoming who you were as a queer man, becoming as you were as a human being. Your younger self is not your current self, and you don't denigrate by saying, well, that other self isn't real, or I've progressed. So that innovation that Chris has of recurring looks at himself, from Lions and Shadows in 38 to Christopher and His Kind in 76 to the interviews that he reflects on himself much later, is incredibly important in understanding the narrative technique, which is part of queer identity for both of these men and links them very tightly. I want to just read a couple of very, very short things from my chapter. The first one is an interview with Studs Terkel, a favorite of many of ours, and those conversations were great. This is a 1977 conversation, and Terkel was sort of saying, you keep returning to yourself, and what Chris was saying was, those are truths. Those are truths at those moments, which is a very Vedanta thing. And so Studs says, he's talking about the memoir, Christopher and His Kind, you're looking at yourself now and saying, here's the real Christopher Isherwood, not the one you read about earlier. In a sense, you are still outside looking at yourself. This is that sort of author-curator function duality. And here's what Chris says to Terkel, which I think is wonderful. There are actually three, aren't there? There's the author, now 72. There's the character who appears in the Berlin stories in his 30s. And there's also the real Christopher, not as he's presented in the Berlin stories in his 30s. These are three quite different people. So this idea of subjectivity, of his self-consciousness, of understanding the relationship between truth and fact, and understanding the sedimentary layer of all these selves, creates a wonderful open place for the queer archives to live, because it means that we're not looking back in judgment and saying, well, they didn't really know how to live, and now we're so hip and progressive and we know what we're doing. Nor is it a kind of, I'm unactualized and now I'm actualized. At each stage, they understand the relationship between themselves and the world in which they're living, and they are brave enough to leave it all out there so that scholars like us and scholars generations from us can sift back through that and see what's there without the sort of editorial function being assumed by the author. That's what I think is the great strength of Isherwood's narrative innovation across all genres, but particularly in queer archives and queer biography.
That's beautifully said, Wendy. Thank you. Sue, do you want to respond in any way in terms of how you felt, and then we're going to move to our next guest?
No, Wendy's remarks are just brilliant, and she so gets the archive and Isherwood as both a writer and his own curator, and then the three selves. I just think that's brilliant. So thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy, very much. And Sue, thank you both for being here with us today. I now bring on the scholar Carola Kaplan, who's Emerita Professor from Cal State Pomona, and who wrote the very first dissertation on Christopher Isherwood. And Carola gave us a real hidden treasure, which is for our first book, she happened to mention in passing, would you guys be interested in an interview that I did with Christopher in 1973 and never published? And we said, yes, you don't really get the voice from the grave that often. So we're very happy to have Carola Kaplan with us today from Topanga Canyon. Carola, good morning.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
So can you talk, you're coming back?
Oh, okay. I'm here.
There you are.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about, you have the long view on Isherwood because you were one of the very first people to really work on him. So just give us a little sense of how working on him, kind of helped you grow up as a scholar and a teacher and a person, actually.
Oh, okay. Very good. Well, I was very lucky. I met Christopher Isherwood when I was a graduate student And I was searching for a dissertation topic, and I was so tired of all the dull papers I'd written in graduate school. When I read Christopher Isherwood's writing, I loved it so much that I said, I really want to write a dissertation about him. And nothing had been written about him at that point. There were no books of criticism, not even a dissertation. So serendipitously, I read that Christopher Isherwood was going to be speaking at the Claremont colleges. And at that point, I was a newly appointed assistant professor at Cal State Pomona. So that was a neighboring area. And I went to hear him. And he was so accessible and forthcoming that I got up the courage to ask him at the end of his talk whether I might write a dissertation about him, and in light of that, if he would give me an interview. And he was very friendly and very welcoming. And he said, yes, I'm listed in the phone book. Just give me a call. And I did. I called him and made an appointment to speak with him. And I met him at his home. And it was a wonderful interview. I mean, he was so personal, witty, passionate. It was just wonderful speaking with him. And he talked about everything, his writing, his life, his emigration to America, his conversion to Vedanta, his homosexuality. And it was just a lively, wonderful experience. And I was able to incorporate some of that interview in my dissertation, which I'm sure was by far the best thing in it. And many years later, Chris and Jim published that in the Isherwood Century. It was the concluding piece, so that it finally saw a wide audience.
And we did the same thing in this book with ending with another interview, because it's so nice to let Isherwood speak for himself,
Yes, and
so, Carola, can you tell us a little bit about the piece that you did for the book? We'll just hear a couple minutes from you about that, and then we'll go to our next guest.
I would like, however, before I do that, I would like to read. I gave a whole graduate course on Christopher Isherwood, and one of my students talked about what Isherwood meant to him, and that was my experience over the years, that Isherwood often meant a great deal to individual students.
Oh, please do share that. Yes.
I'd like to read that. Okay. Dr. Kaplan introduced me to this man called Christopher Isherwood, who wrote intimately about himself and his fascinating life, who had the panache to make himself a character in his stories, who explored themes of alienation and the elusiveness and multiplicity of the self. Here was a writer who had tapped into issues that consumed my own thoughts about the trajectory of my life, who, if he did not know the answers either, at least was asking the same questions I had been asking for a long time. If it were not for this course, I would still be living in a world without Christopher Isherwood. No divine decadence, no Prater Violets, no Vedanta, no meetings by the river, no Uncle George, no single men.
Love it. Love it.
I just love that. So you can see teaching Isherwood was a surefire hit. Okay, I'd like to read a little bit, the introduction to my essay in Isherwood in Transit. In Down There on a Visit, Christopher Isherwood sets out to capture, or rather to compose, with an older man's hindsight and a novelist's heightening, scenes that illustrate who he was at 4 key points in his life. A retrospective of Isherwood's development as a man and as a writer, these vignettes function as a bridge between the European and the American Isherwood. They illustrate, through these crucial episodes, Isherwood's development from a very young, newly published author, to a British sojourner in Berlin, to a British exile seeking a new home, to an emigre in America and recent convert to Vedanta. But these vignettes not only reconsider the life Isherwood in fact led, they also contemplate the life that Isherwood might have led, the path he might have taken, but did not. As the episodes in Down There on a Visit reveal, what prevented Isherwood from pursuing extreme, alternative life possibilities was his relationship with four figures who served as extreme alter egos, who were able in their radical positions to reveal to Christopher a fundamental truth about himself. In his dealings with Mr. Lancaster, the dogmatist, Ambrose, the anarchist, Valdemar, the hedonist, and Paul, the cynic, Christopher encounters himself, or a grotesque version of himself, in a series of funhouse mirrors, in each of which he gets to view, engage with, and ultimately reject one of his own most extreme possibilities. So, in addition to its other merits as a novel, Down There on a Visit offers an excellent overview of Isherwood's development as a man and as a writer.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's such an important novel. I think it's Jim's favorite of Isherwood's books, actually. So, Carolyn, thank you for joining us today. We're going to bring on Badan Roy now from Cal State LA. So, Jim, I'll let you introduce Badan. And Badan, we're very glad to have you with us today. We've got Badan and one more speaker.
So we have Badan Roy, who's professor of English at California State University, Los Angeles, where he teaches post-colonial literature and 20th century British literature. And we've been talking back and forth about Isherwood and Vedanta for a number of years, sort of another LA connection for us all. And it's great to see you here, Badan. Well,
great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about teaching Isherwood at Cal State LA? What your experience is, a little bit maybe how your students receive him?
Sure. I arrived at Cal State LA in the mid-2000s, and I really got to know Isherwood through Cal State LA. He taught there during the 1960s and wrote and set Single Man there. And in the department, the English department office, you see a couple of Don Baccardi drawings, paintings in there, one of Isherwood and one of Dorothy Parker. So that was my kind of entryway into him. And one of the things that got me interested in him was the kind of biographical connections in a strange way we have. Obviously, I'm from England originally, but then I'm also British Indian. So his interest in Vedanta was something I didn't really know about before Cal State LA, and something I became a research interest as soon as I got there.
That's great. And what do you teach most often? Which book?
Probably A Single Man. It's my favorite of his. I think it's kind of the best in terms of its craft, but also its it's sort of a tangential or indirect representation of Vedanta that I think is his best engagement with Vedic ideas. So for those reasons, it tends to be that. Yeah,
and you're right. I momentarily forgotten. In the novel, it's called San Tomas State.
Yeah.
Right, something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was when you're talking about the English department office, I had that memory of walking down the hallway in that building and going into the office, and it's like, oh, there it is. There's
yeah.
Big portrait, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I'm remembering that. So that's great. So you wrote for us a piece about Isherwood and the perennial philosophy called In Search of a Spiritual Home. Do you want to share a little bit of that essay with us?
Sure. There's the opening passage in A Single Man and the closing passage in A Single Man that I'll read in a little bit. Really, the essay came and from trying to explain these passages and trying to understand these passages. They're remarkable passages, and they're very different stylistically and kind of formally to the rest of the novel that's relatively kind of linear, realistic novel in the middle parts. And these two kind of bookend passages force a re-evaluation of reading that as a kind of linear, realist novel. So if it's okay, I'll read those two passages so the stuff I talk about makes sense from there. So so let me read the kind of first section, the first passage. I'll read the opening and then the closing. Waking up begins with saying am and now. That which has awoken then lies for a while staring up at the ceiling and down into itself until it has recognized I, and therefrom deduced I am now. Here comes next, and at least negatively reassuring, because here this morning is where it has expected to find itself, what's called at home. And then the closing passage, but that long day ends at last, yields to the night time of the flood, and just as the waters of the ocean come flooding, darkening over the pools, so over George and the others in a sleep come the waters of that other ocean, that consciousness, which is no one in particular, but which contains everyone and everything, past, present, and future, and extends unbroken beyond the utmost stars. So I really, some of my favorite writing of, any period and anywhere. And one of the things I think that struck me with the Vedic ideas there are the kind of the spatial and the temporal questioning and the questioning of the self, because the self that appears in the novel is kind of undermined or dissolved in these two sections. So while on the one level it is a kind of semi-autobiographical as well as, fictional account of one man's life, it's also got all these moments that question the reality of not just literary representation but existence, and force you to kind of go deeper and question what that self is. And that I think all comes from Isherwood's practice and study of Vedanta that I think was kind of dismissed a lot during the time he was alive, but also after his death as well. And I think now with some of the new approaches to perennial philosophy, it's been reappraised, and certainly in his fiction, I think that's his kind of greatest articulation of those ideas.
Yeah, and we've made an effort since the Isherwood century to really have scholars talk about Isherwood's spiritual practices and spiritual beliefs and how that's influenced his work since 20 years ago. And during his lifetime, especially early in his life, his friends, mostly his English friends, just put down any interest in Eastern religion and collapsed it all into yoga.
Right.
In just the most appalling terms. Yeah. I mean, even Auden called it that heathen mumbo jumbo.
Right.
So it was just, during his lifetime a struggle. And then when he published his last memoir, My Guru and His Disciple, he was just lambasted for that as well. So it was a struggle for him. But to not pay attention to that in our work, because our work has brought in so many different voices, to make a space for that has been really important. So thank you for that, for the latest part of that.
Yes.
And it's interesting that you link a lot of you use in your essay linking to the Perennial Philosophy, the book by
Huxley.
Thank you. My brain is not working. By Huxley, who was a personal friend of Isherwood's, and
yeah.
Huge influence, brought him actually into Vedanta. So that's a really important connection to make. So thank you for that. Are you going to share a bit of it, your essay?
Sure. I'll read the last kind of paragraph or so.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you for everybody for staying with us. I just looked at the time.
I'll be quick as I can here.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
To read A Single Man in light of Isherwood's perennial philosophical approach to Vedanta, then, is to recognize how it gives form to the concept of non-duality. It is a queer spiritual vision insofar as it enables Isherwood to make his sexuality part of this vision in a way that is not evident in most representations of Vedanta, including his own non-fiction writings on the subject. But it is also a spiritual vision that is, in its own terms, irreducible to categories of identity. Its radicalness lies in its inclusive vision of non-duality, not in its particularization of it. On a formal level, the single man confronts one of the biggest challenges that faced Isherwood in bringing Vedanta to a Western audience. That of translating the Vedic concept of non-dualism in a culture grounded in conceptions of the individual by using the image of that other ocean at the end of the novel as a recursive device that destabilizes conceptions of the individual character.
So, Vedant, thank you. And your piece goes so well with Victor Marsh and Jamie Carr also in the book, working on that spiritual part of his life. Thank you very much. We're going to now bring on the speaker, Barry Boric, who's joining us from Chicago. Barry's a professor at DePaul University and is, for my money, one of the best theorists and practitioners we have of creative nonfiction. And Barry, we were so happy to be able to get you in the conference and in the book to talk about Isherwood and his nonfictions. So I'm just going to turn things over to you and let you say a few things about your take on Isherwood's work, and then we'll wrap things up. So thank you for being here, Barry.
Thank you. Thank you so much for including me. I just, pulling some threads from what's come before, I just want to comment that the reason I am involved in this conversation as a practitioner, as a creative nonfictioneer, as some of us call ourselves, is it's because of queer friendship. You know, it's because Jim and I go way back to Minneapolis, and all power to Minneapolis right now. And, you know, through queer friendship, we find alternate paths to knowledge and to the ongoing development of a literary queer point of view. So I say that to harken back to Armistead's Logical Family at the beginning of our conversation here, because, you know, that's why I'm here. I come from creative writing rather than lit studies. Chris and Jim asked me at the symposium at the Huntington to talk about Isherwood's nonfiction in the context of the contemporary creative nonfiction conversation. So that's what I did, and the title of my piece actually echoes back to Wendy Moffat's conversation with Studs Terkel. The title of the essay is Three Quite Different People. I also referenced the Studs Terkel in my piece. Studs Terkel is particularly close to me as a Chicagoan because when I was growing up, Studs Terkel was the kind of prototype immigrant Chicagoan, urban man of the people. So his interview with Isherwood, which my father would listen to Studs Terkel, you know, in the car driving on the freeways in Chicago, and his conversations, the idea that Studs Terkel interviews Isherwood, and Isherwood says to him, you know, wouldn't you like to know who the German Studs is? You know, kind of collapses worlds for me and makes them very exciting. So I'm going to read a little bit from my piece where I play around with the point of view that Isherwood plays around with in Christopher and His Kind, and it's set in the section I'm going to read is set in Santa Monica. The area has a particular sense of placiness for me, the whole coastal region of the LA metro, because my brother lives in Redondo Beach, and he's a former Chicagoan living his California dream story. I visited that coastline often. I biked that path into Santa Monica, and so I already knew the area. And so when I got this assignment from Chris and Jim, I decided I wanted to go have a look at the place. So I wanted to see it. I wanted to see the view from the place. I told Chris I was going to look around, and he told me repeatedly, be sure you look over the fence. Be sure you look over the fence. So it's kind of what kept me going. So I skulked around the neighborhood. I told Jim on Facebook yesterday, I want to call it skulkatory journalism. So I'm going to read I've got about 3 minutes here. There's three different sections here. This is a segmented piece that moves between kind of creative writing and more scholarly stuff. Interlude of Her Kind. The first time she attempts to find the author's address on Adelaide Drive, she gets lost. She is driving an unfamiliar rental car, which is part of the problem. She visits from one of the dense cities back east, where it's been too long since she's owned a car. She has lost her driving reflexes. And it's so hilly on that side of Santa Monica. In her first attempt, she misses the street entirely, shooting off into the canyons, and has to navigate a series of one-ways until getting back to the beach, past the building with the camera obscura, as if the whole neighborhood says, I am a camera, and then making sure to turn up the hill before those glass apartments on the waterfront. She would have been content to just drive by his house, but friends had told her to be sure and peek over the fence. Which fence? And where could she park? And really, she's not a stalker. She just wants to see what he saw. Every author is a camera, but in the human body, images do not merely process, but impress. Voice is both what we come from and what we come to. All she wants now is to see his view. And then this section here is, hold on a second here. Up that sunny hill. What then is a homeland, and how can we know if we've written ourselves there? Some homelands are that original location that made us, but other homelands, the one we seek out as adults, are those places where we imagine we can remake ourselves, a sanctuary where we may not worry about presentation or judgment. Particular location is central to homeland, even if the actual experience is ephemeral. Some leave, some return, some perpetually quest. Homeland is always the half mythical, wholly unreachable shining hillside on the horizon, more process than destination. The climb up that sunny hill where the view spills out is less a destination than a daily trudge. And one more interlude of her kind. She does finally park the car at the end of the block on another street entirely and walks up to the sprawling Ocean View houses. When she can't find the house number, she stops in puzzlement. It's the middle of the day and no one is driving up or down the hill but workmen gunning the gas, slamming on brakes so as not to hit the blonde woman wearing a cactus green dress that matches her tattoos, standing on a road lined with desert landscaping, trying to peer over fences unobtrusively. Looking for what? The houses don't interest her, but when she gives them her back, what she sees is that wild and marvelous sea. To look at this sea every day, do you pause and consider how you got to this window? Because this is the view that fills the windows because you met your love on.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love that piece, Barry. I think what you've done for the way we read Isherwood as a writer is a real contribution. I think this is a next wave, getting past his fiction to the nonfiction. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
And I love that line. She just wants to see what he saw.
Yes, and you saw it. And we're so glad that you told us that way. So Rira, we're going to bring you back on to help us wrap up today's event. And we want to thank all of you for being here. I don't know if we have time to answer a couple of questions. I think everybody was so sort of holistic in their approach that maybe we answered the questions already.
Our speakers, they did answer a lot of the questions that did pop up, but there are some questions for you guys. So this is a question from Evan Knopp for James and Chris. What do you hope Isherwood in Transit and your other books on CI will inspire, or how do you hope they resonate with contemporary queer authors?
Well, first off, thanks, Evan, for coming. And second, also, I should say, first off, thank Vromans.
Yes,
for
Vera,
hosting.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Evan, this is, for us, a follow-up to our previous book called The American Isherwood, because we really want Isherwood to be seen as a significant American writer. When we were coming out as graduate students, Isherwood was not paid attention to, even in the context of gay studies or queer theory. And Isherwood has such a broad audience, both for scholars and general readers, that we wanted to really make sure that he got some attention. And we had a conversation with the publisher, Doug Armato, the other day about how scholars and readers and publishers all work together, and bookstores to sort of bring writers back that have been forgotten or neglected. And that's part of what we had hoped to do, not just as scholars, but as fans of Isherwood. And as scholars, we're not supposed to say that we're fans of the writer that we study, but we came to Isherwood as fans first. And so we want to make sure that there's space for different types of reading of Isherwood, different types of readers, and to create a space in the academy for him to be taken seriously. And so we've spent a lot of time working with other scholars to make sure that to encourage the scholarship on Isherwood and to encourage it in a way that's really accessible to readers.
Well, and you can see from the people we had on today, we curated this event, we curated this book, and you heard from each of those people a different piece of Isherwood, but they're all that guy. And that's what we've spent the last 25 years trying to do for ourselves, I think, is we're learning about ourselves through him, and we're teaching that stuff, and we're writing about it, and we're creating a community. That was always our goal, and it has been very fulfilling to work on Isherwood. Just like Chris Bram said, it's fun to spend time with him.
Well, thank you so much, Jim and Chris. It was such a wonderful conversation you had with all of our speakers. Again, thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to all of you who tuned in this morning, this evening. I know we have people from all over the world tuning in. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And again, if you are interested in supporting our bookstore, if you just click on the purchase button directly below the screen, you can check out the book, and it will take you to our website. Yes, and that's the cover right there. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming virtual events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. And with that said, thank you to everyone again, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. We really enjoyed talking with you today.
Bye-bye.
Love you guys.